'cause you can't, you won't, and you don't stop. Or when you can't, you won't, and you don't stop. Mike D coming down for sure.
Once we understand that there are perhaps different standards other than ethics that might apply and lead to how society thinks about a problem, it leads to a very interesting question, right? And that question is, does ethics actually vary by, say, country or time period or by organisation? Or is there truly only one standard that applies to everyone? This is a meta-ethical question, right? It's a question about the nature of ethics itself. And it's a topic that's often called ethical relativism. So we're just going to explore this a little bit. Now, I want to say from the beginning that I'm not going to give you an answer to this because, in essence, it's a philosophical belief that you would hold. There are implications that flow from ethical relativism, or if you're a non-relativist. And so I think it's worth understanding what it means if you accept one of these positions. Okay, let's get into it. So we can see that around the world, different groups have different standards around etiquette, what's acceptable to do in one culture. So maybe eat with your mouth open is not acceptable in another culture. We have quite different laws. Okay, who's allowed to drive is an example of a law that varies by country. And of course, we know that there are different religions in various countries. So given we have this variation in etiquette, law, and religion, then we should expect a variation in ethical standards, shouldn't we? And so that's where this idea of ethical relativism springs from, is that what's ethically right or wrong depends on the particular situation that we're involved with. It's relative to the culture, and it's also relative to the individual. So by way of example, in country A, it might be considered unethical and illegal to educate a certain class of person, whereas in country B, there might be a general view that all people are equal and should have full access to education. So what this suggests is that denying access to education is ethical in one country, but unethical in a different country. Let's look at a specific business example where this might occur. So for instance, we're going into a foreign market and we might have to pay what's termed a facilitation fee. For those who don't know, a facilitation fee might also be considered a bribe, right? It's not an official fee that you would pay, but you pay it to a government agent to help facilitate the transaction. Okay. So we pay it in cash, it's not recorded, and it's not legally required if you want to import. But if you don't pay it, then the goods are going to be delayed or destroyed. So the question is this ethical or unethical? Because in your home country, it might be considered unethical and illegal. It might be a bribe. But in the country you're going into, it might be considered accepted practice. According to moral relativism, the choice is ethical and unethical. It's ethical or right within the foreign country and unethical in the home country. At a deeper level, we can also get variation by individual, because individual A may favour the ends as the standard of ethics. So they look at the ethical outcome about what they're going to achieve. And they would say, pay the facilitation fee because more people benefit. Whereas executive B may favour duty or a deontological approach to ethics, and they would say, no, you shouldn't pay bribes. And both of those individuals under ethical relativism would be acting ethically because they're acting in accord to their own ideas of ethics. So I hope you can start to see that if we accept ethical relativism, it starts to throw up a few problems, which is often why moral philosophers don't accept that particular position. So it can be attractive at first, but one of the real problems that arises is that just while a view on ethics may be accepted within a culture, it doesn't actually mean it's right. You know, it was only several hundred years ago that most people believed the earth was flat, not round. And I think there are still some people who believe it's flat, but let's not get into that. So you get the idea, just because something's broadly accepted within a culture, within a time frame, doesn't actually mean it's true. The second thing with ethical relativism is that we've got to think through the difference between an ethical principle and the expression of that principle within a culture. So while we may express an ethical value differently between cultures, the underlying principle may actually be the same. And these differences that we may perceive may not be as great as what they first appear. I mean, we've all just been through the COVID pandemic, and so one of the things that we can see there is that certain people's rights and obligations were traded off for the safety of others. And is that any different to, for instance, the Inuit practice of leaving the elderly to die when conditions were harsh? So we have these very interesting problems that arise if we accept ethical relativism. If we go one step further, we can actually see that these problems cause a number of significant problematic consequences. The first thing is, if you accept ethical relativism, you can't criticize any other practices. All they've got to do is say it's ethical for me or in my culture. And an ethical relativist position has to accept that. If it's also true, our own standards can't be criticised. Okay, so no one can say, hey, we can make society more ethical by these changes, because by the definition of relativism, what is ethical in our society is what's right. So there's no grounds on which to criticise us as well as others. And what that means in total, so because of these problems that we have in terms of accepting the relativist position and the consequential flow on to our inability to judge anyone's behaviour as ethical or unethical, or even if we're just worried about ourselves, we can't develop in terms of ethics because there's no standard to actually develop towards. For those reasons, most moral philosophers don't actually accept ethical relativism. Instead, they believe that there are absolute standards of ethics, just like there are absolute standards of truth. Some things are true or they're not. Now, we need to be very careful here because we need to be able to differentiate. If I'm making that statement, there's a lot wrapped up in it, right? Some people don't believe that there is truth, right? So you could point to the example I had before, like they used to think it was true that the earth was flat, and now we think the truth is that the earth is round. But what we're doing there is we have to differentiate the difference between truth, which is an idea, right, about what something is, and fact, which is what we accept. A fact is not necessarily the truth. They're quite different things. Okay, so I think this idea of having an absolute standard is not saying that we actually know what it is yet, but hopefully we're progressing towards that standard. That is not possible if we have a relativist position. Now, having said all that, we do need to recognise that just because we don't accept ethical relativism doesn't mean that we're right. In fact, it means the opposite. We should constantly be questioning and learning from other ethical systems that are in place to really question our own standards and work out whether they're actually true. So I think one of the major benefits is actually personal to me about developing my ethical perspective, but also ethical for us as an organisation if we're in business and even as a society. So we're able to learn from each other, and there's no supremacy of one cultural system. It doesn't, like what one might be better, it doesn't mean that it's absolutely better and can't improve, right? It might be more ethical than another, but it doesn't mean it's the high end of being ethics. There's always a possibility to improve, which is why we should look to other cultures. Also, having an ethical standard doesn't mean that you always act exactly the same in every situation. Okay, so the ethical choice So this is quite an interesting and important point behind the philosophy, right? We can still believe that there is an absolute standard and that what is right or wrong depends on the situation, right? We don't have to insist that there's only one law or one approach that applies to every situation that you'll come across. But what we are rejecting is this idea that what is right and wrong varies by person, right? If an approach or a decision in a particular situation applies to someone, it applies to everyone. So let's bring it back to business. What does it mean for business? Well, number one, what's socially acceptable may not be what's ethical to do. That's particularly important in this world that we're currently living, where there seems to be a lot of impression management going around. Number two, we can learn from other organizations, other people, and other cultures. Why do they do things this way? What's the ethical reasoning behind what they're doing? We're not necessarily 100% right. We can always improve. And number three, if we go into another culture, we don't necessarily just have to accept what their standards are. In fact, you may choose not to enter that particular market if you believe what you would have to do is unethical. So really, there's a strong interplay in that kind of decision between ethics and your business strategy, right? So, ethical relativism, a meta-ethical question. It's something that you have to draw your own conclusion on, whether you believe ethics is relative or not, whether there are absolute standards. Most moral philosophers don't accept ethical relativism for the problems that arise if we do accept it. So if we accept that there's no ethical relativism, but we also allow different situations to give to lead to different answers, one of the questions for us is, when might we be conditioned or nudged to act unethically or in a way that we wouldn't normally act, right? We might make a decision a certain way at home and a different way in the workplace, right? That sounds like relativism. And to truly understand why that occurs, we're going to move into a more descriptive area, which is what actually happens to people when they get into organizations. What about organizations can affect the ethical decision-making and actions of people within those organizations?